The morning mist clung to the ground as Elisabeth Reeves trudged through the muddy village road, clutching her threadbare woolen shawl tightly around her slender shoulders. At 23 years of age, she had already endured more sorrow than most faced in a lifetime. The Great Plague had swept through her small village in the English countryside 3 years prior, claiming her husband and both parents in a single fortnight. Only she and her young son Thomas, now 5 years old, had survived. Despite her hardships, Elisabeth's striking beauty remained undiminished. Her long golden hair fell in waves past her shoulders, framing a face with high cheekbones, full lips, and piercing blue eyes. Even in her worn dress, patched multiple times and cinched tightly at the waist with a fraying cord, her feminine figure was evident. The neckline of her dress, originally modest, had been stretched and worn with time, dipping lower than propriety dictated, drawing unwanted attention to her collarbone and the curves beneath her shabby garments. "Mistress Reeves," called out the village magistrate, Harold Watson, as he hurried to intercept her. "I have been searching for you." Elisabeth paused, her son Thomas hiding behind her skirts. "Master Watson? What business brings you looking for me?" she asked, her voice revealing her wariness. "A writer arrived yesterday with a sealed letter," Watson replied, producing a slightly crumpled parchment. "It bears a seal I do not recognize, but it is addressed to you." Elisabeth accepted the letter with trembling fingers. Letters rarely brought good news to those of her station. She broke the wax seal, a strange emblem of an eagle clutching a rose, and unfolded the paper. "What does it say, mother?" Thomas asked, peering up at her with curious eyes. Elisabeth read aloud, her voice growing increasingly confused. "It says that my great-uncle, a man named Percival Reeves whom I have never heard mentioned, has died and left me his property near Willowbrook Forest, some 20 miles hence." Watson raised his eyebrows. "Percival Reeves? The hermit of Meadowvale Cottage? I had no knowledge he had any family." "Nor did I," Elisabeth admitted. "The letter states I must present myself to the solicitor in Willowbrook by week's end to claim my inheritance." Watson snorted. "That old cottage is a ruin, Mistress Reeves. It is said the old man was touched in the head, living alone in that decrepit place with naught but a mangy dog for company." "Even a ruin would be more than what we have now," Elisabeth replied softly, thinking of the corner of the village barn where she and Thomas had been permitted to sleep since her husband's death. 3 days later, after a grueling journey on foot, Elisabeth and Thomas stood before Meadowvale Cottage. The magistrate's assessment had been generous. The small stone structure was more than a ruin, it was nearly reclaimed by nature. The thatched roof had collapsed in several places, vines climbed the crumbling walls, and the small plot of land surrounding it was overgrown with weeds and brambles. "Is this our new home, Mother?" Thomas asked, his small hand clutching hers. Elisabeth swallowed her disappointment. "Yes, my love. With hard work, we shall make it habitable again." A sudden bark startled them both. From around the cottage bounded an old, shaggy dog, its coat matted but its tail wagging furiously. "The hermit's dog," Elisabeth whispered, kneeling to let the creature approach. The dog sniffed her hand, then licked it enthusiastically before turning to Thomas and doing the same. "Can we keep him, Mother?" Thomas asked, already petting the animal. "I suppose we must," she replied. "What shall we call him?" "Keeper," Thomas decided immediately, "because he kept the house for us." Their first night in the cottage was spent in the only corner with an intact roof. Elisabeth had managed to clear enough debris to create a small sleeping area, and she held Thomas close for warmth as the late autumn wind whistled through the many gaps in the walls. "Uncle Percival could not have left us much of a legacy," she murmured to herself as her son slept, "but at least we have a place to call our own." The following days were spent in exhausting labor. Elisabeth cleared debris, patched the roof with whatever materials she could find, and attempted to make the cottage livable. Thomas helped as much as a 5-year-old could, mostly by playing with Keeper in the overgrown garden. On the third day, as Elisabeth worked to clear what had once been the cottage's main room, Thomas came running in, excitement lighting his face. "Mother! Mother! Keeper found something! Come see!" Elisabeth followed her son outside to where the dog was frantically pawing at the ground near an ancient oak tree that stood at the edge of the property. "He has probably found a rabbit hole," she said with a tired smile. "No, Mother. Look." Thomas pointed to what appeared to be a small metal handle protruding from the soil where Keeper had been digging. Curiosity piqued, Elisabeth knelt beside the dog and brushed away more soil. The handle was attached to what seemed to be a small iron chest, buried just beneath the surface. With effort, she managed to extract it from the ground. "What is inside?" Thomas asked, bouncing with excitement. The chest was locked, but the lock was old and rusted. Elisabeth found a stone and, with several determined strikes, broke it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a journal bound in cracked leather and a small pouch that clinked when she lifted it. The pouch contained a handful of silver coins, more money than Elisabeth had seen in years. But it was the journal that truly captured her attention. Opening it carefully, she found it was the diary of Percival Reeves, dating back nearly 40 years. That night, after Thomas had fallen asleep, Elisabeth read by the light of their small fire. The journal's early entries revealed little of interest, the daily musings of a solitary man. But as she progressed deeper into the pages, a different story began to emerge. "I've been entrusted with a secret that could topple the very foundations of the realm," one entry read. "Lord Grantham swore me to silence, but I fear what might happen should this knowledge die with me. The true heir lives, hidden away where the usurper cannot find him." Elisabeth's heart raced as she continued reading. The entries became more cryptic, speaking of the treasure beneath the waters and the eagle's true nest. Percival wrote of meetings with mysterious nobles, of documents hidden where only the innocent might find them, and of his growing paranoia that he was being watched. The final entries, dated just months before his death, were the most disturbing. "They have found me. I know not how, but they have. I have moved everything to the only safe place remaining. May God guide my true kin to find what I have protected with my life." Elisabeth slept fitfully that night, her dreams filled with visions of hidden treasures and shadowy pursuers. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. A well-dressed man on horseback arrived at the cottage, introducing himself as Colin Grantham, the steward of nearby Willowbrook Manor. "My lord heard that old Percival's relation had claimed the cottage," he said, his eyes sweeping over Elisabeth's form in a way that made her uncomfortable. "He sends his regards and an offer." "An offer?" Elisabeth asked, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "My lord wishes to purchase this land. It borders his hunting grounds, you see. He would pay you a fair sum, enough to establish yourself more comfortably elsewhere." Elisabeth hesitated. The offer was tempting. The cottage was barely habitable, and money would provide security for her and Thomas. But something about the steward's demeanor and the mysterious journal entries gave her pause. "I thank your lord for his generosity," she said carefully, "but I have only just arrived. I would like time to consider my great-uncle's legacy before deciding." A flash of annoyance crossed Grantham's face. "Of course," he said smoothly, "but do not take too long. My lord is not known for his patience, and his offer may not remain open indefinitely." After the steward departed, Elisabeth found Thomas and Keeper by the small pond at the edge of the property. The boy was throwing sticks into the water, which Keeper enthusiastically dove in to retrieve. "Mother," Thomas called. Keeper keeps swimming to the middle and trying to dive down. Elisabeth watched as the dog paddled to the center of the pond, then attempted to submerge himself, only to bob back to the surface. "The treasure beneath the waters," she whispered, recalling Percival's journal entry. That night, after Thomas was asleep, Elisabeth returned to the pond with a lantern. The autumn air was cold, but determination warmed her as she waded into the chilly water. At the center, where Keeper had repeatedly tried to dive, she felt something with her feet, something solid and unnatural. Taking a deep breath, she submerged herself fully, hands searching in the murky bottom. Her fingers closed around what felt like a chain, and she pulled with all her might. To her surprise, it gave way easily, and she surfaced gasping, holding a waterproof leather satchel attached to a heavy chain anchored to a stone. Back inside the cottage, shivering in dry clothes by the fire, Elisabeth opened the satchel. Inside were sealed documents bearing the royal seal, a small portrait of a noble-looking young man with a striking resemblance to the current king, and a letter addressed to my blood kin. The letter, written in Percival's shaky hand, told an astonishing tale. Percival had not been a simple hermit but a former royal secretary who had uncovered a terrible secret. The current king was not the rightful heir to the throne. The true heir was the king's older brother, who had not died in childhood as officially claimed, but had been hidden away after witnessing a murder committed by their ambitious younger brother. Percival had helped the true heir escape to the continent with proof of his identity, but kept copies of the critical documents as insurance. The current king, now aware of Percival's knowledge, had been hunting him for years. The Lord of Willowbrook Manor is the king's loyal servant, the letter continued. He has been tasked with acquiring my property and destroying any evidence I might have left behind. If you are reading this, you are in grave danger. Seek out Father Michael at St. Agnes Abbey. Show him the ring enclosed in this satchel. He will know how to contact the true heir. Elisabeth's hands trembled as she emptied the last contents of the satchel, a gold signet ring bearing the same eagle and rose emblem that had sealed her inheritance letter. She barely slept that night, her mind racing with the implications of her discovery. By dawn, she had made her decision. She would take Thomas and the documents to St. Agnes Abbey, a day's journey away. As they prepared to leave, hoofbeats approached the cottage. Through a crack in the shutters, Elisabeth saw the steward, Colin Grantham, returning, this time accompanied by half a dozen armed men. "Mistress Reeves," he called out. "Lord Willowbrook insists upon an answer to his offer today." Elisabeth's heart pounded. "Thomas," she whispered urgently, "take Keeper and hide in the secret space behind the hearthstones, just as we practiced yesterday. Do not come out unless I call for you." After ensuring her son and the dog were safely concealed, along with the satchel of documents, Elisabeth stepped outside to face the steward. "Master Grantham," she said with forced calm, "I was not expecting you again so soon." Grantham's smile did not reach his eyes. "My lord is eager to conclude our business. Have you considered his offer?" "I have," Elisabeth replied, "and I must decline. This cottage, humble though it may be, is my inheritance and my son's future." The steward's expression hardened. "I see. That is unfortunate. My lord suspected you might prove difficult." He gestured to his men. "Search the cottage. Thoroughly." "By what right do you invade my home?" Elisabeth demanded, stepping in front of the door. "By right of the king's warrant," Grantham replied coldly, producing a document. Old Percival was suspected of treason. Any papers or possessions of his must be examined for evidence of his crimes. Elisabeth's blood ran cold as the men pushed past her into the cottage. They ransacked the small dwelling, tearing apart the few pieces of furniture, pulling up floorboards, and knocking down sections of wall. She prayed that Thomas would remain silent and that the men would not discover the cleverly disguised hiding place behind the hearth. After nearly an hour of destructive searching, the men emerged empty-handed. "Nothing, sir," reported one to Grantham. "Just an old cottage with nothing of value." Grantham's eyes narrowed as he studied Elisabeth's face. "You are certain you have found no papers, no documents among your uncle's possessions?" "Only the deed to this property," she lied, "which is safely stored with the village magistrate." The steward stared at her for a long moment before speaking again. "My lord's offer still stands for now. But know this, Mistress Reeves, this land will become part of Willowbrook Manor, one way or another." He leaned closer. "Accidents befall isolated cottages all too frequently. Fire. Brigands. It would be a shame for anything to happen to you and your boy." With that thinly veiled threat, Grantham and his men departed. Elisabeth waited until they were well out of sight before retrieving Thomas and Keeper from their hiding place. "We cannot stay here," she told her son as she gathered their few possessions and the precious satchel. "We must leave immediately for St. Agnes Abbey." They slipped away through the forest rather than taking the main road, Elisabeth constantly looking over her shoulder for signs of pursuit. Thomas, sensing his mother's fear, asked no questions but kept pace as best his little legs could manage. Keeper led the way, seemingly understanding the need for stealth and haste. By nightfall, exhausted and hungry, they reached the outskirts of the village where St. Agnes Abbey stood. Rather than approaching directly, Elisabeth chose to seek shelter in a barn for the night, planning to visit the abbey at first light when they would attract less attention. As dawn broke, Elisabeth woke to the sound of monks chanting matins. She led Thomas, still groggy with sleep, toward the imposing stone structure of the abbey. Keeper followed at their heels, unusually subdued. At the abbey gates, they were met by a young novice who regarded them with surprise. "We seek Father Michael," Elisabeth said. "It is a matter of great urgency." The novice hesitated. Father Michael sees visitors only after midday prayers. "Please," Elisabeth insisted, lowering her voice. "Tell him I bring the eagle's rose." The young monk's eyes widened slightly before he nodded and hurried away. Minutes later, an elderly man in simple robes appeared, his keen eyes taking in Elisabeth, Thomas, and Keeper with a single glance. "I am Father Michael," he said. "Come with me quickly." He led them through the abbey to a small private chamber where a fire burned in the hearth. Once the door was securely closed, Elisabeth produced the signet ring from her bodice. Father Michael took it with trembling hands. "After all these years," he murmured. "Where did you find this?" "It was among my great-uncle's possessions," Elisabeth explained. "Percival Reeves." Recognition dawned in the old monk's eyes. Percival, so he kept his oath until the end. He gestured for them to sit. "Tell me everything." Elisabeth recounted her inheritance, the discovery of the journal and the satchel, and Grantham's threatening visit. When she mentioned the documents bearing the royal seal, Father Michael's expression grew grave. "May I see them?" Elisabeth handed over the satchel. The monk examined each document carefully, occasionally making soft sounds of surprise or confirmation. "These are genuine," he finally said. "Birth records, witness testimonies, the former king's private declaration, all proving that the current king is a usurper who took the throne through deceit and murder." "What does this mean for us?" Elisabeth asked. "Grantham will surely return to the cottage and discover we have fled." Father Michael nodded soberly. "You and your son are in grave danger, as is anyone who knows of these documents." He paused, thinking deeply. "There is only one safe course. I must send word to the continent, to the true heir. Until he can return with sufficient support to challenge his brother, you must disappear." "Disappear?" Elisabeth echoed. "How can we simply vanish?" "The abbey has means," Father Michael assured her. "We maintain safe houses for those who need protection from powerful enemies. But first, we must secure these documents where the king's men cannot find them." That evening, as Thomas slept in a small cell provided by the sympathetic monks, Father Michael and Elisabeth concealed the critical documents within a false compartment in a statue of St. Agnes herself. The usurper's men would not dare desecrate a holy relic, the monk explained. And even if they searched the abbey, they would find nothing incriminating. 2 days later, Elisabeth and Thomas departed the abbey disguised as a widow and her son traveling to live with relatives in the north. Father Michael had provided them with new clothing, a small cart, and sufficient coins for their journey. Keeper trotted alongside, his coat brushed and cleaned so that even he looked different. Their destination was a remote priory near the Scottish border, where they would live under assumed names until it was safe to reveal the truth. Before they left, Father Michael shared one last piece of information. "The true heir has been contacted," he whispered. "He lives in France under the protection of the French king, who has long suspected the truth. With these documents as proof, he will finally have the support needed to reclaim his rightful throne." "And what will become of us?" Elisabeth asked. "You, my child, are the keeper of a secret that will change the fate of the realm," Father Michael replied. "When the true king returns, you will be honored among his most loyal subjects." The legacy your uncle left you is worth far more than land or gold. It is justice itself. As their cart rumbled northward, Elisabeth held Thomas close, watching the familiar landscape of her homeland fade behind them. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with potential danger, but for the first time since her husband's death, she felt a flicker of hope for their future. "Mother," Thomas said sleepily against her shoulder, "will we ever go back to Uncle Percival's cottage?" Elisabeth stroked his hair gently. "One day, my love. And when we do, it will be as honored guests of the rightful king." 6 long years passed in the quiet sanctuary of the Northern Priory. Elisabeth and Thomas, now known as Mary and James to those around them, lived a simple life. Thomas grew from a curious 5-year-old into a strong, intelligent 11-year-old boy. Elisabeth, still youthful at 29, had adapted to their new life, working as a herbalist and healer in the Priory's infirmary. Keeper had remained their faithful companion until passing peacefully in his sleep the previous winter, having lived a remarkably long life for a dog. Thomas had mourned deeply, but the memory of their loyal friend remained a comfort. On a crisp autumn morning, much like the day they had first arrived at Meadowvale Cottage, a messenger arrived at the Priory bearing a letter sealed with the now familiar eagle and rose emblem. With trembling hands, Elisabeth broke the seal and read the contents. Then, tears streaming down her face, she embraced her son. "What is it, mother?" Thomas asked, confusion and concern in his voice. "It is over," she whispered. "The true king has returned and reclaimed his throne. The usurper has been imprisoned for his crimes." The letter contained more than just news. It was a royal summons commanding their presence at court and officially restoring to Elisabeth not just Meadowvale Cottage, but the entire surrounding estate of Willowbrook Manor, the property of the treacherous lord who had threatened them, now stripped of his titles and lands. "We are going home, Thomas," Elisabeth said, using his real name for the first time in years. "And we return not as peasants, but as favored subjects of the crown." Their journey south was vastly different from their flight north years before. Royal guards escorted them, and they traveled in a comfortable carriage rather than a humble cart. Villages and towns passed in a blur until at last they crested a familiar hill and saw Meadowvale Cottage in the distance. But the landscape had changed dramatically. The cottage had been rebuilt, larger and finer than before, though still modest compared to the great manor house visible on the neighboring hill. The overgrown land had been cleared and planted, and a new stable and outbuilding stood, where once there had been only wilderness. As their carriage approached, Elisabeth was startled to see a royal standard flying above the cottage. And standing at the door, surrounded by attendants, was a tall, regal man whose face she recognized from the portrait she had found in Percival's satchel all those years ago. "His Majesty has awaited your arrival most eagerly," their escort informed them as the carriage stopped. Elisabeth and Thomas descended from the carriage and knelt before the king, who immediately gestured for them to rise. "Elisabeth Reeves," he said, his voice warm with genuine emotion. "At last I can thank you in person for your courage and loyalty. Had you not discovered my loyal Percival's evidence, I might never have reclaimed my birthright." "Your Majesty honors us," Elisabeth replied, her head still bowed. The king smiled. "It is you who honored the crown by preserving the truth at great personal risk." He turned to Thomas. "And you, young man, have grown strong and tall. Your father would be proud." Thomas looked up in surprise. "You knew my father, Your Majesty?" "I did not have that honor," the king replied, "but I know he was a good man who died serving others during the plague. Such sacrifice deserves recognition." With that, the king announced that Thomas would be given a place at court when he was of age, to be educated alongside the royal children. And Elisabeth, should she wish it, was granted a position as a royal herbalist, her skills having become renowned even beyond the priory. "But first," the king concluded, "I believe you both deserve time to reacquaint yourselves with your home, your true home, not as peasants living in a ruin, but as the honored custodians of an estate that has played a pivotal role in the history of our realm." That evening, after the king and his entourage had departed for the palace, Elisabeth and Thomas sat before the fire in their rebuilt cottage, marveling at the turn their fortunes had taken. "Mother," Thomas said thoughtfully, "do you ever wonder what might have happened if Keeper had not found that chest beneath the oak tree?" Elisabeth smiled, remembering their faithful dog. "I believe some secrets are destined to be revealed, my love. Your Uncle Percival did not leave his legacy to just anyone. He left it to family, to those he knew would recognize its true value." Thomas nodded, satisfied with her answer. "Then Keeper was part of our destiny, too." "Yes," Elisabeth agreed, looking around at their transformed cottage, no longer a symbol of poverty and desperation, but of justice restored and promises fulfilled. All of it was. The inheritance that seemed worthless, the cottage that appeared ruined, the land nobody wanted, all hiding the greatest treasure of all, the truth. Outside, the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky above Meadowvale Cottage. Elisabeth Reeves, once a desperate widow struggling to survive, now stood at her doorway, looking out over land that was truly hers. Her son's future was secure, justice had prevailed, and the shadows that had haunted them for so long had finally been banished by the light of truth. The peasant woman who had lived in seeming poverty had discovered a secret worth more than gold, a secret that had changed not just her own destiny, but that of an entire kingdom.